Today we're going to talk about probably one of the most influential philosophy articles of the past century. And it's this article called Freedom and Resentment by Peter P.F. Strawson. It's kind of an odd article. It sort of had two lives. It was pretty successful when it came out in, the early 60s, where it was taken as an argument largely about the ongoing dispute between compatibilists and incompatibilists about freedom and determinism. But it's had this sort of second life that has been much more influential in the past, 20 odd years, where you will find people, David Shoemaker in Tulane, Pamela Hieronymi in UCLA, who will just rave about this as if it's the best thing ever, the bee's knees, this article. And I think the reason for that is largely not because it contributes to this debate on freedom versus determinism, but because of all the stuff about the reactive attitudes. At one point in the article, he says, it's a shame that talking about the moral sentiments has gone out of fashion because, I think this would be a productive area to work in. Well, people took him up on that, and that has become ethics, more or less. His discussion of things like the reactive attitudes has just mushroomed. But it happened, about 30, 40 years after this article was written. So it's sort of, as I say, it was like a slow-burning fuse, and then it's taken off more than he could ever imagine. I can't remember when he died. I actually saw him. He gave the speech when I was an undergraduate. He gave the speech to our year. Not an exciting speaker, I will say. But he was. And the other thing that's kind of weird about this article is he himself was a little bit dismissive of it because he thought his most important work was his work on philosophy of language. That's where he made his name. He wrote an article called On Referring that was critical of something like Bertrand Russell and produced a very snipey response from Bertrand Russell. And also he responded with another philosopher, another British philosopher called Grice, to a famous article by the great American philosopher Quine. So that was all stuff kind of in the 50s. And even earlier. And then he came to this kind of topic late in life, and he didn't write much on morals. It was this and basically one other article. And he kind of just sat down and wrote them. It wasn't like this was his life's work. And yet this is the one that people remember and talk about. What's also interesting about Strawson is you might say, hey, that name looks familiar. Well, his son, Galen Strawson, also writes on this topic, the original topic, which is freedom versus determinism. And Galen Strawson is actually critical of his father's argument, as far as people can understand the argument in this article. And Galen Strawson is pretty much would be in this third camp that Strawson talks about in the first paragraph. All right, so let's lay out the basic structure of this article. He starts off by talking about optimists versus pessimists. And I have a problem with this article. It's beautifully written to a certain extent in that, there are sentences that are amazingly crafted, but it's not. It's very kind of cutesy. It doesn't say anything really directly and there's no great argument that goes. You couldn't sort of. Some articles, they will actually boil the argument down and they will present it to you premise, conclusion. That is, Strawson is above that kind of thing. It's more like let's have a conversation, a very erudite conversation about these things, and I won't name anybody in particular. I won't name a specific philosopher and talk about them. I will talk about these kinds of people, and you have to work out who I'm talking about. All right, and I think this has partly led to the huge profusion of writing on this article because it's open to competing interpretations. Perhaps the king of this kind of philosophy, who I think was influential on Strawson, is Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's later work in particular, he would say kind of gnomic things, and it would be like a religious text that his followers could come in and say, well, I think he means this by it. And so people would say, well, no, you're crazy, he means this by it. But of course, you don't know because he doesn't explain himself very clearly. And there's a bit of that in Strawson, and consequently there are competing interpretations of some aspects of it. So if you struggled with reading this article, with getting what he means, I feel for you. And some of the sentences are just, they're just, break it down for me a little bit. Did you have to have quite that many clauses and that many negatives, triple negatives or whatever? But anyway, here's one view of it that probably there are plenty of people who would say, oh, you're completely missing the point. But here's the simple version. Okay, so he talks about optimists and pessimists and moral skeptics. The optimists are essentially compatibilists, what they are called nowadays. Okay, so compatibilists are so called, as you probably know, because they say that free will, the kind of free will specifically that is necessary for moral responsibility, is compatible with determinism. That is, even if the universe is deterministic, such that if I raise my hand, that was preordained by the laws of the universe, such that I could not have done other than that, given the state of the universe before I did it and the laws that govern all the particles in the universe. My raising my hand could still be free, according to the compatibilists, even if it was determinist. The pessimists, by the pessimists, Strawson means incompatibilists. Now, as you probably know, incompatibilists come in two kind of variants. There's the hard determinists, who say that determinism is true, that basically incompatibilists say you can't have both free will and determinism. So there's the people that say we have determinism but not free will. Those are the hard determinists. And there's the people that say, well, we have freedom, so therefore we can't have determinism. And those are people like Chisholm, for example, who say that we are able to be prime movers unmoved. That is, human free agents are capable of, in some sense, disrupting the causal order of things by being the first uncaused cause of our actions. So when I raised my hand, it was not determined by the laws of the universe. I did that, and I started a causal chain that can't be traced back any further than me. Now, which of these camps does Strawson himself fall into? He's largely an optimist in that he does believe that we are capable of responsibility, that is, morally responsible actions, or that responsibility is something that cannot be removed from human life. And the way he talks about human life also reminds me of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was enormously influential, particularly on British philosophy, all throughout his philosophical career. He was very influential. Wittgenstein is divided into sort of two stages. There's the early stage with something called the Tractatus, which is very much like the what are called the logical positivists in the early 20th century work in philosophy. And Wittgenstein was seen as kind of the apotheosis of that with the Tractatus. But then he completely changed his view and came up with his later work. The Philosophical Investigations is the most famous work of that, which is all this kind of gnomic statements and talking. A lot of it sounds like fortune cookie stuff. But that second stage, sort of in the 50s, was hugely influential in British academia. And I think there's a definite Wittgensteinian flavor to some of the stuff that Strawson says about human life and how you cannot remove our practices of holding people responsible and reacting to people as if they were responsible. Human life wouldn't be human life without them. So in that sense, he says, you're not going to get rid of responsibility. Whether or not determinism is true, you're not going to get rid of responsibility. But he has a criticism of the optimists, and he sides with the pessimists in this respect. One of the big debates that's related to this free will versus determinism debate is how to justify punishment. So, for example, suppose I do something wrong. I commit a murder or something. If the incompatibilists say, if determinism is true, then I can't be held responsible because I just did it and I couldn't do otherwise. So the pessimists tend to say a vital requirement for holding me responsible is that I could have done otherwise. Whereas if determinism is true, I couldn't have done otherwise. There was only ever one thing I could do, and it was determined by the state of the particles I'm made of and the laws of the universe, the state of the universe at a certain stage, and the laws of the universe determined that I would commit that murder. So in some respects, holding me responsible for committing that murder is like holding the iceberg responsible for sinking the Titanic. It's just something that happened. It's the way the world is, or holding the asteroid responsible that killed the dinosaurs. You shouldn't have killed the dinosaurs, asteroid. That was bad. That's ridiculous. It couldn't do otherwise than hit the planet as it did. And every murderer or everybody who does anything can't do otherwise. And therefore, say the incompatibilists, you can't hold them responsible. A compatibilist response to this, to justify punishment, that was popular in sort of the mid part of the 20th century, is to say, yes, in some sense, it does seem a bit weird to say that people who do wrong deserve punishment. This is called retributivism. That is, the justification for punishment is to give people what they deserve is retributivist. The compatibilists sort of, at the time Strawson was writing this paper, rejected retributivism and say, oh no, and besides they tended to say things like, that's a bit barbaric, that's just like revenge, punishing people because you want them to suffer. Ooh, that's a bit, we're above that kind of thing. So what they tended to offer as a justification instead was forward-looking concerns like deterrence or prevention or rehabilitation. So, for example, if your justification for punishing murderers is deterrence, you're punishing the murderer as a warning to would-be other murderers. You're saying, look what happens to people who murder. So our justification for punishing this murderer is to save future victims, to prevent possible future murderers from doing it, because they'll see this sign, oh, this is what will happen to me if I commit murder. I don't want that to happen to me, so I'm not going to murder. So that's a forward-looking justification. Retributivism is a backward-looking justification. It says, you did something wrong, so that's why we're punishing you. Whereas forward-looking justifications say, the reason why we're punishing this person is to prevent future bad things happening. And rehabilitation is another one. We're making good people that were formerly bad, and prevention. Here's this murderer clearly has shown themselves that they will harm people. We'll just lock them away, and that way we'll save the people who would have been killed by them from being killed. Okay, so those are the kinds of justifications that compatibilists were giving. And Strawson, I think quite rightly, says those are the wrong kinds of reasons. And I agree with the pessimists, I agree with the incompatibilists. You can't use future concerns to justify punishment, because notice what that means. Future concerns don't just justify punishing guilty people, they justify punishing innocent people. Because suppose I found out, well, I can't actually, brutal murders have been committed. I can't actually catch the real murderer. Maybe the real murderer has died. But I can catch this guy who everybody hates. He's like a homeless guy who disturbs the local populace because he never washes and goes around ranting and swearing and, shits on the sidewalk. Everybody hates this guy. We'll say he did it. And we'll take him in and then we'll punish him. And if everybody thinks he did it, then punishing him will be just as much a deterrent as if I punished the guilty person. So forward-looking justifications don't provide the right sort of reasons for punishing. We believe we have this strong intuitive conviction that we should only punish the guilty. And that's a retributivist conviction. So he sides with the optimists, and he's against libertarian. He has a an oft-quoted slur against libertarians. He says right at the end of the article, he refers to the obscure and panicky metaphysics of libertarianism. He's targeting people like Roderick Chisholm there, people who say that we are the prime movers unmoved. And he says, what's that bullshit? That doesn't make any sense. And there's another point earlier in where he also makes some pretty nasty comment about libertarians just being kind of intellectual frauds. So he's really down on this idea that we can, in some sense, act against the laws of physics. Now, he also says, I don't even know what determinism is. And this is like, really? This is a kind of coy move. It's basically to say that the issue of determinism is a lot more complicated than people make it out to be. Probably he has doubts about the nature of causation or the nature of, or what laws are like and things like that, because the definitions of determinism tend to be rather simplistic. And he's probably says those definitions don't even make sense. So he actually counts himself as someone who says, I don't even know what determinism is. So how can he say anything about this debate without even knowing what determinism is? Well, he's going to come up with a view that essentially says the facts as we know them defend continuing our practices of holding people responsible and regarding them in a certain way. And in some sense, it doesn't matter if determinism is true or not. So that actually points him in almost diametrically opposed to his son, Galen Strawson, who wants to say, we are not morally responsible whether or not determinism is true. So the father, Strawson, says we are morally responsible whether or not determinism is true. and the son says we're not moral responsibility, the kind of free will that is necessary for moral responsibility, is impossible whether determinism is true or whether it's false. So in some sense, Strawson Jr. is an extreme pessimist about the possibility of responsibility, and the father is an extreme optimist. All right, what is all this business? Okay, this is probably the main reason this article will be remembered, is this idea of the reactive attitudes. And so I said again that this article doesn't really give you much in the way of argument. So what does it give you? Why is it so regarded as such a great piece of philosophy when it doesn't do the thing that philosophy is supposed to do? Because he describes, puts a name to, and begins an analysis of something that was very underexplored. And he points out is that there are emotions that we have. Emotions are something that we tend to regard as sort of deeply ingrained in our animal nature. And in some sense, philosophers don't often talk much about emotions. Emotions are sort of things that get in the way a lot of the time, as Spock might say. Whereas what Strawson does is he says, look at commonplaces that people don't really think about, but let's actually really look at types of feeling that we have. Resentment. It's in the title. Why is resentment so important? Well, think about what resentment is. It's a particular kind of feeling. When do you feel resentment towards somebody? Well, when they've done you wrong, when they've done something to you, but not always. He says, look, imagine somebody steps on your hand. You're crawling around on the floor because you dropped something and somebody steps on your hand. You are angry, obviously, but you also would feel resentment to them. What does that mean? It means that you think that you are owed something, and I'm not sure I can't remember if Strawson himself uses this phrase. He certainly talks about what we feel we are owed. A basic kind of goodwill by others, or regard. Yes, that's commentators on Strawson, of which, as I've said, there are many, have come up with a phrase for this. It's called the basic demand. The basic demand is that other people show us goodwill or regard. That is, that people respect us in some way or treat us as beings worthy of treating well, interacting with, not dismissing. People want to be respected at a certain basic level. They don't want to be dismissed as worthless or treated as like, non-human animals. And you feel resentment when you think that somebody has violated the basic demand. That is, they haven't given you the regard that you deserve. Now, merely having your hand trodden on by somebody is not enough to trigger resentment if there are excusing conditions. Okay, so if you feel like, for example, the person knew your hand was there and didn't do enough to stop themselves treading on your hand, perhaps they trod on it on purpose, then the resentment will be strongest. You will really resent them if you think they did it on purpose and if you think they did it because they don't think you're worthy of taking into consideration. That's when resentment is powerful. Now notice what is built into this idea. what is built into this idea is that people are responsible agents. The feeling of resentment is a way of holding someone responsible. So what Strawson does that's so novel in this article is all of the discussion about responsibility tends to focus on the people doing the actions, like the murderers or whatever. Now, who's doing the actions in this case? It's the person treading on my hand. But the focus of Strawson's article is not so much on them, it's on me. It's on my reaction to them. And what he's saying is, responsibility isn't, the focus of responsibility shouldn't be on the person doing the action. It should be on the people reacting to the actors, the reactors rather than the actors. So he says responsibility is, responsibility should be viewed as a response. The philosopher David Shoemaker likes to say you can't say responsibility without saying response. And a response is something done not by the person that we're holding responsible, it's the rest of us that are responding to them. So that's what's important about the reactive attitudes. So the reactive attitudes are a sort of automatic way of holding someone responsible. It's not that we're intellectually saying, that person is a free agent and they have done something, so therefore I shall hold them responsible. That's not how we operate. It's built into what it is to be human to have this response. And that's what our practices of responsibility are built on these attitudes. And they're not something that we could ever get rid of. That's kind of the key point that he makes. He says, look, responsibility is to be found in our responses, and they are a practice. They are a practice, a human practice that we do that is completely immune to all this kind of intellectualizing about, is determinism true? So his main point, I'm going to skip ahead to, and I'll come back to it more slowly, is whether or not determinism is true is a theoretical issue. And he says, I don't even know what determinism is. I haven't come across a good definition of it yet. But suppose I do, and suppose I decide, oh, that's true or that's false. Neither of those things are going to affect whether or not I feel resentment next time somebody treads on my hand. I'm going to do it. And that's what it is to be human, and we don't want to remove that from humanity. The idea that that's something that should be applauded or that we should work towards. I mean, philosophers do, famous quote from Marx, the philosophers have just described the world, the point is to change it. Well, a lot of philosophers actually agree with Marx on that and say, you know, our philosophical conclusions should change human life. So, for example, someone like Peter Singer, who argues that we should treat animals better. He says, look at, I have a persuasive argument that should persuade you that you actually are someone who should be a vegetarian because of your beliefs that you already have. Singer would say the world would be a lot better if we followed our rational conclusions and we became vegetarians. This kind of thing, though, Strawson says, suppose we become convinced that determinism is true. Should we stop holding people responsible? No, he says. Not only shouldn't we, but we can't. Well, his first point is we can't really, because it's just the way we're made. It would require rewiring our very natures to do that. It would require, you know, centuries of programming to change human beings into the kind of creatures that don't hold people responsible. So, what Strawson examines is he says, look, let's look at these various attitudes. And basically they come in three levels. the participant reactive attitudes are interpersonal, like person to person. You feel resentment to another individual. But there are also related, he says, vicarious analogues of the direct person-to-person ones. What he means by that is where you have a particular kind of feeling, but it's not because of a direct personal interaction with another individual. It's you're witnessing other people interacting and you have a response. Again, it's a response to them. So, for example, disapproving. It's kind of at one remove. You're no longer a participant in in an interaction, but you are aware of an interaction. So, for example, if you see someone being mugged or something like that, you're not the victim, you're not the mugger, but you still have a response. This is what he means by the vicarious analogues of the participant there. And these, he say, are more like morality. These are like moral practices. It's a disapproval that has a moral tinge to it because you say, that's wrong. So in some sense, you can see why this article has led to this huge industry on the moral sentiments, because this is an example of a sentiment, an emotional feeling that is at the core of morality. So now this isn't something that Strawson himself invented. All kinds of philosophers, most famously David Hume, have talked about these kind of things. But as I said, it has shifted, this article more than anything, has shifted the focus of ethics in general, as it is done in the Anglo-American world. And so all of the focus is, there's a huge amount of interest now in talking about morality and its relation to emotions and sentiments and so on. So we have the direct participant reactions, of which resentment is an example. It's not the only example, of course. He's got a list. And, you know, other people have come up with more, with their own taxonomies of these kind of things. And you can look that up. But it's sort of a first pass. This is the part of his article that has led to it being so influential. And notice that he's only really talking about this as a way of talking about this issue, which is not really considered the interesting part of it anymore. It's more this kind of stuff. Also, there's self-reactive attitudes where you know you're engaged instead of engaged in an interaction with somebody else. You're looking at yourself and having feelings based on your view of yourself. So, for example, you have a feeling that you should do something. Why should you do something? Because of this. If you don't do the right thing, you feel bad, and that is part of this self-reactive attitude. Okay. Now, what he says is, so we have feelings like resentment, which is just this perfect example. That's why it's the one in the title, because it's such a clear example where you shouldn't feel resentment if, I don't know, a robot ran over your hand. A robot's walking down the street, and you know, or you know, you hurt your hand at the factory. You work with this machinery, and you hurt your hand because you put your hand in the wrong place. It would be stupid to feel resentment. You might sort of feel resentment because you think somebody's trodden on it, and then you realize, oh no, it was a robot, and the resentment should go away. Why? Well, what this means is the way you feel also has this cognitive element, has this element where you say, this feeling has cases where it's appropriate and cases where it's inappropriate. And you can affect whether or not you feel this feeling if you decide that it had an inappropriate target. And cases where these happen, he said they fall into two kinds of camps. Now, again, this is like basic demand. This is terminology that people who have written about Strawson use, but Strawson himself doesn't. The first kind, he basically says, just uses examples, and he does it in this kind of this way that is that I find rather annoying, where he just gives examples of phrases. Where is it? I haven't got it. But he says where the kind of phrases are like, I didn't mean to do it, it was accidental, or something like that. That first group, as he calls it, some commentators, including most famously a guy called Gary Watson, who is a very well-known writer on free will, calls excusing conditions. So, in other words, if somebody treads on my hand, I look up at them and I feel resentment, and they say, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, somebody pushed me, or that was completely accidental, I was miles away. I'm so sorry. Your resentment should go away, because even though you're in just as much pain, you excuse them because basically they show that they didn't violate the basic demand. They do hold you in regard, and the pain they caused you wasn't a sign that they don't hold you in regard. It was just an accident or something like that. Okay, that's one way in which you would stop feeling resentment. And in other words, you would have a different response. Now notice, why is he talking about this? Well, because it's leading up to, so he says there are standard ways in which we suspend these kind of attitudes which constitute our human practice of holding people responsible. If the pessimists are right, then determinism should itself be a ground for not feeling resentment. That if we find that determinism is true, resentment should go away if the pessimists are right. If if determinism is incompatible with the kind of freedom that is required for responsibility. This is what responsibility is. That's Strawson's big contribution. Responsibility should be understood not as a power that the actor has, but as a set of responses to humans acting in other humans. That's where responsibility is to be found. That's Strawson's big contribution. So should responsibility, which is these kinds of responses, these kinds of attitudes, should that be undercut by knowing that determinism is true? Is knowing that determinism is true one of these ways that will cause us to not feel resentment? And it isn't. It just isn't. That's his main point. But let's look at the difference between these two kinds of attitudes. So excusing conditions and then exempting conditions, what are they like? One where he wasn't himself like somebody was temporarily incapacitated. Maybe somebody had slipped them a drug or something. Somebody had drugged them. So it wasn't that they, well, I'll explain the difference between the two in a second. But the first kind would be temporarily out of it, like just like dazed or drugged or something like that. And then the second kind is if they are genuinely incapable of acting responsibly because they're insane. I shouldn't use the term insane for schizophrenic. They're mentally ill in the way that undercuts responsibility, that they just cannot be in control of themselves. Either that or, severe mental incapacities of some kind. What's the difference between excusing and exempting? Well, excusing conditions, they mean they sort of particularize your removal of resentment to this interaction. So in other words, but they don't mean that you don't hold the person who steps on your hand, you don't regard them as a responsible agent. I'm doing what Strawson does. I'm doing too many negatives. If it's an excusing condition, for that one occasion of them standing on your hand, you understand that they shouldn't be resented for that because it was an accident. But they remain the kind of beings that you can hold responsible. So if they do it again, then you're going to feel resentment. Because, I mean, even if they say, oh my goodness, I did it again. Well, you're going to start to resent them because they say, well, now you're the kind of person who clearly screws up a lot. And, you know, maybe that's a sign that you're just careless with other people. I forgave you once, but, you know, now you're looking like you've got a serious problem here and you don't hold me in regard. You are violating the basic demand. So in other words, you continue, in excusing conditions, you continue to regard the people you excuse as capable of responsibility. They are members of the moral community. You expect them to follow the rules. They violated one this time, but it was an accident, so you excuse them on this one occasion. But you still hold them as the kind of beings that can follow the rules. Whereas in exempting conditions, either temporarily or permanently, they're not part of the moral community at all. Because, in other words, you don't have to hold them responsible, which, being removed from the moral community has some advantages. People don't hold you responsible. People don't expect you to follow the rules. But it has a much greater disadvantage because they will regard you as incapable of acting for yourself, and therefore you can be basically controlled. And you should be controlled. I mean, somebody who is, for example, a violent schizophrenic should be institutionalized. And you don't do that with somebody who is responsible for themselves. They're not institutionalized. They might be in prison, but there's a difference between being in an institution where you will stay there indefinitely and being in prison where at least you know what your sentence is. So what happens when the exempting conditions are in play is we take the objective attitude to the person that we exempt. Now, the objective attitude is where we don't regard them as another moral being. We sort of step back and we say, oh, they're an interesting natural phenomenon. Now, as he points out, we can take the objective attitude temporarily to other human beings, even if we regard them as moral agents. And my dad used to do this all the time. He was, not with me necessarily, but he was a big fan of psychology. So, for example, if somebody was being a bully and I came home and complained about it, he would say, oh, probably the kid is abused at school, or this kid has feelings of inferiority, or something like that. In other words, what he's doing is he's taking the objective attitude. He's saying, look at this individual not as someone that you have an interaction with, that you regard as another person and that you can resent and so on, but look at them as a kind of an interesting phenomenon, like an animal, that you look inside them and you know, oh, this is what makes them tick. This is why they're doing the things that they're doing. You're not responding to them as you do other human beings. They're not potential friends. They're not potential anything. They're just kind of a complicated, fleshy machine. That's the objective attitude. Now, that's what psychologists do tend to... if you psychoanalyze people constantly, you're taking the objective attitude to them. So, for example, about a murderer, you wouldn't feel horror towards them. You would feel, at most, you would feel pity. And that's a sign that you're taking the objective attitude, because you no longer think of them as as you think of yourself. You think of yourself as somebody who can do certain things and has certain abilities. Whereas when you take the objective attitude to another person, you think of them instead as just a little robot that follows certain rules. Now, what the pessimists seem to be implying is that if determinism is true, we should always take the objective attitude to all other human beings, because they are just cogs in this giant machine of the universe that do what they do because of determinism. So the pessimists think we should always take the objective attitude. Strawson's point is we can't do that because that's not the way humans work. We are humans that just have feelings. As he said, yes, here we go. So I suppose we must say that it is not absolutely inconceivable that it should happen. That in other words, we should become the kind of people that take the objective attitudes. But I'm strongly inclined to think that it is, for us as we are, practically inconceivable. That is inconceivable for us to, the way of life that this would require, taking the objective attitude to all people at all time, we can't imagine what that would be. That wouldn't be a human life. The human commitment to participation in ordinary interpersonal relationships is, I think, too thoroughgoing and deeply rooted for us to take seriously the thought that a general theoretical conviction, belief in determinism, might so change our world that in it there were no longer any such things as interpersonal relationships as we normally understand them. That's his main point. His main point is that responsibility is a thing humans do, and it is to be found in our reactions to people that are moralized. So his big contribution is to say, look at where responsibility is. It's embedded not just in our intellectual life, but into our emotional life. It is in our feelings towards other people. Our very feelings are ways of holding people responsible. And however much someone might tell you, oh, you can't hold that person responsible because determinism is true, they couldn't have done otherwise, that's not going to stop me feeling resentment. And resentment is responsibility. It's our practice of holding people responsible. So stop worrying about the determinism debate, you optimists and pessimists. It's not going away. Now, so he says the optimists are essentially right. We got responsibility, but optimists tend to think we've got responsibility because determinism is true, whereas Strawson's view is it doesn't matter whether determinism is true. It doesn't matter if we don't even know what determinism is. Responsibility is not going anywhere. But he does agree with the pessimists, remember, because he says our justification for punishing people shouldn't be forward-looking. We should punish people because they've done something wrong, according to the rules of holding people responsible. Why should people be punished? Because they violated the rules. It should be backward-looking. The justification for punishment should be backward-looking, as the pessimists say, but the pessimists are wrong to say that this is only justified if their panicky metaphysics is true, if we are the cause of our own actions, we are prime movers unmoved. No, you don't need any of that bullshit, says Strawson. It's just our feelings, the way we do it. Okay, so that's Strawson's view. It's a weird kind of compatibilism, and it's kind of, it doesn't fit neatly in the debate, and it sort of takes things off on this wild tangent that has spawned its own industry. But that's this article, and that's why it's held in such high regard and is considered so influential.